to our first research panel of the day. Theme for this panel is myth and disinformation and diaspora community. And we're excited to have Dr. Pranav Malhotra from the University of Michigan to lead this panel with me. Dr. Malhotra is a assistant professor at the University of Michigan, Department of Communication and Media. His research focuses on how the affordances of social and mobile media intersect with cultural and relational norms, influence how people engage with information and each other in mediated spaces, especially in understudied social and political contexts. In particular, he has examined the use of more private spaces on social media, including how people evaluate the credibility of information within these spaces. Professor Malhotra's work has been published in leading journals, including Social Media and Society, Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, Digital Journalism, and International Journal of Communication. So we will start off this with a conversation between Dr. Malhotra and me that introduces the panel and reflects on this area of research. After that, we will have 4 presentations with 15 minutes each. Our presenters today are Dr. Dina Abou-Fotu from Dalhousie University. She will join us on Zoom. Joan Ozawa from University of Texas at Austin will also join us on Zoom. And then Dr. Jane Pugh from University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is here with us. And our last presenter will be Sarah Nguyen from University of Washington. She is on Zoom as well. So for the last 15 minutes, we will have a Q&A session for all of your questions. So let's kick off my conversation with Dr. Malhotra right now. So Dr. Malhotra, can you first give us a brief introduction to your research, some background on your research that's related to today's topic, diasporic communities and misinformation?
Sure. Yes, I would say in terms of my research, as you described, a lot of the research I've been doing is looking at more private spaces on social media, which I call bounded social media places. So these are kind of private chats on mobile messaging apps like WhatsApp, WeChat, KakaoTalk, but also private communities on Discord, private groups in Facebook, anywhere there's kind of these visibility control mechanisms. And as we'll talk about in this conversation, I think that's somewhere where diasporic scholars have kind of led the way, because there's a lot, these spaces are where a lot of people belonging to diasporic communities engage with information from back home, but also engage with their interpersonal ties back home. And so that's kind of what led me to this area. In my own work, in my own dissertation work on bounded social media places, I oversampled for diasporic communities. They weren't the only people in the sample, but they made up a lot of the sample because I wanted to kind of cover a variety of these platforms. And I saw that, each community was kind of associated with specific platforms, as Jane will get into later as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you have written a lot on the platform affordances and especially what you call bounded social media places. So today we have presentations about both public platforms like Twitter or X and more private ones like WhatsApp. So based on your own research, how are these two kinds of spaces different from each other in terms of misinformation? And do you think this distinction matters for diaspora communities in particular?
Yeah, I think they are pretty distinct, and I think that has evolved over the years. I think even something like saying like Facebook or Twitter is a public platform at this point is probably not accurate, because there are private spaces like within Twitter or private spaces within Facebook. And I think over time, for both diasporic and non-diasporic communities, there's been this kind of shift towards the use of these more private spaces. In terms of the distinction for misinformation, so when I was doing my work, and this was a mixed method study, so I did interviews with users of different bounded social media places and kind of asked them to walk through their credibility evaluation process. So when they do receive information, kind of how do they go through it? What heuristics do they use? And then I also did an experiment kind of comparing public spaces on social media to private spaces on social media and see if there were any differences in the credibility ascribed to the same message just from being in a private group and being in a public group. So in that work, I found that the perceived intimacy of bounded social media places was kind of the mechanism that explained why some people trust information within more private spaces more. So there was this idea that these spaces are intimate, that they facilitate kind of authentic and genuine conversations. And when people talked about comparing them to more public spaces, the perception of public spaces is that they are kind of geared towards maximizing engagement, kind of what we heard from Dr. Brene Weiser too, this idea that because the intention there is to get likes, to get comments, to get visibility, that they're somehow perceived as inauthentic, and there is more kind of less credible information out there, at least perceived so. A couple of other findings that are relevant to some of those presentations we're going to have today that I wanted to highlight. One of them being, one of the things that came up a lot, especially in my interviews, was the role of algorithms and how algorithmically curated spaces, which are typically these more public spaces on social media, are kind of seen with a level of distrust, are seen as promoting not too credible information, promoting mis and disinformation, whereas in the more private spaces where algorithms play either no role at all or a minimal role, at least perceived to be. It was interesting because, so for example, in private Facebook groups, you know, they are algorithmically curated. The posts you see are not chronological. But even in those spaces, people were like, well, I don't actually perceive the role of the algorithm. And so when you kind of have personal agency over curating information, there is, it's kind of tied to your identity that you trust the information more, because there's this sense that, well, I am the one who's curating this, I'm the one who's elected to join these groups, or I am the one who's like created this group chat. So then I trust the information there because I trust in myself to surround myself with kind of people who share credible information, whereas in a more public space, that responsibility is almost gone to the algorithm. The other kind of key finding that I wanted to highlight that also relates to some of our presentations is how in these more private spaces, sharing information is more directed towards like keeping relational ties alive, that there is this kind of sense that you need to keep sharing something. So even if you think of like the extended family group chat for those who are part of those, and there's definitely a lot of work with diasporic communities because those exist a lot, where people will share information just to keep that chat alive, whether or not it's true. So those are kind of some of the findings. In terms of the diasporic communities, as I said, I think these private spaces have been something that diasporic scholars have been looking at for a while, because these are the places most closely tied to home for a lot of them. It's where they engage with information, where they engage with family back home and friends back home. And I think as kind of ethnic media has started to disappear and has been defunded, these spaces have become even more important for diasporic communities in terms of acquiring information from back home, but also acquiring information in the context that they're in. But I think this has also meant that diasporic scholars, as I said, are kind of ahead of the curve in theorizing about these more private spaces. And I think it's kind of an opportunity for diasporic scholars to take the lead there. And I also think for non-diasporic communities, I think these spaces are becoming increasingly more important and increasingly used. Like as kind of Elon Musk like burns down public social media, we're all shifting towards them. So I think they are kind of qualitatively different, but they're definitely different in terms of how we engage with information and how that intimacy kind of plays into a greater trust in information regardless of its veracity.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And so another common thread that I see from all the submissions to our panel is the cultural dynamics at play in diaspora communities, involving, often the politics, culture, and history, even the platforms of, the home country, as well as a new country that they settle. So do you think this particular context for diaspora communities has any implications for misinformations, at large?
Yeah, for sure. I think the historical and cultural context in particular matter a lot. Understanding kind of how people engage with misinformation requires considering those factors. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of them is from Sarah's work, and we'll hear from Sarah today, where she talks about the idea of, the Vietnamese diaspora and the kind of information they engage with, and this idea that when someone from the Vietnamese diaspora engages with like a post that calls Joe Biden a socialist, the word socialist carries a very different historical and contextual baggage from someone in that community because of the history of socialism in Vietnam than it would for a white American to engage with that same term. They have a different kind of historical baggage. Something similar I've noticed in the Indian diaspora, and this is actually something that I'm looking to do more work on in the future, is a lot of misinformation about immigration in the US, a lot of misinformation about how people coming in from Central America, people coming in from Mexico, a lot of kind of dis and misinformation about them somehow being given green cards at the border and how it's so easy for them. And if you kind of just see it in a vacuum, you're like, okay, like, why is this happening? Why is the Indian community in particular talking about this? But then when you kind of consider the history and the present and what is going on contextually, you see that some of the reasons behind that is that a lot of Indians are frustrated with like green card backlogs and like congressional inaction for their own kind of path towards citizenship. And that is kind of coloring what kind of dis and misinformation they're likely to believe in or be susceptible to. So kind of those historical factors, those contextual factors, I think, especially in thinking about diasporic communities and their engagement with information, I think become very important. I think it's also important to consider how those flow the other way. I think when we talk about diasporas, we're thinking maybe about how they're getting information from back home. But as we'll hear from Zhao later on, American narratives then flow outside of America to other countries. So like, I know we'll hear them talk about this idea of how American narratives were about January 6th were incorporated in Brazilian disinformation. So again, those are kind of those historical and present contextual factors that inform, why certain diasporic communities might be susceptible to certain kinds of dis and misinformation. So I think they're really important to consider.
So I think we have 1 minute left.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that you
Mm-hmm.
and other colleagues put out a syllabus for transnational disinformation on BTAP, which is Bulletin for Information Technology and Public Life. That's curated here at BTAP. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction to that syllabus before we wrap up?
So this syllabus was co-authored with Sarah, who's on this panel, but also Rachel Cohen and Rachel Moran. And really the syllabus is for anyone who's interested in understanding dis and misinformation from a transnational lens and understanding how kind of the historical factors that we're talking about, but also the idea of state power, histories of colonialism, how they have informed the kinds of dis and misinformation that flow on digital media and how they are addressed in kind of different kinds of ways. So if you're like looking for a pedagogical resource to help you teach about dis and misinformation, but from a transnational lens, I would encourage you to go, and it's accessible to anyone to see that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Malhotra. And this wraps up our conversation, and what will follow our presentations today. And the first presenter will be Dr. Dina Abou-Bakr. Is she on? Yeah, she is here.
Hello. It says I can start my video because the host has disabled this. So can you please give me access if you want to see the video, how I look like. But I can share screen for sure. I believe so. I can share screen. Yeah. Okay, so just let me know, please, if you can see my screen. Okay, I'm unable to start the video, but it's okay. I'll just go ahead. Just let me know, please, that if I can start it.
Yep, you're good.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so hello, good morning, and thanks everyone for inviting me to give this talk today. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to come in person, but I'm so glad that there was this opportunity to give the talk virtually. So the talk today is about a case study from Canada about investigating COVID-19 vaccine misinformation in digital spaces. And this is part of a project, so it will be about the computational analysis of newcomer and racialized communities in Canada. The project is a bigger project with Professor Nadia Kaidi from University of Toronto, Faculty of Information, and Hong Shi, a master's at the University of Toronto, and Louisa Taylor, who is the director of Refugee 613. So the background of the project is that it is a bigger project that is called the Vaccination, Misinformation, and Digital Media Project. It was actually funded by Public Health Agency of Canada, and it is a collaboration, as I told you, between the University of Toronto and a community organization, Refugee 613, who is based in Ottawa. And it has a multi-method approach using focus groups, interviews, and computational methods. So some of the context that the doctor talked about is that basically COVID-19 had a disproportionate impact on racialized and immigrant populations in terms of the vaccination and even the death toll. So we know that, for example, the Stats Canada report that came in 2020 said that the communities who had like less than one or more than 25% of visible minority had actually mortality rate that was 10 times higher than those who had less than 1% of visible minority. We also know, for example, that refugees and other newcomers to Canada account for nearly about maybe half of all COVID-19 cases in Ontario. So this is alarming, and added to it the fact that vaccine hesitancy is higher among newcomers and refugee populations because of issues of trust and because of maybe sometimes the amount of misinformation that was circulating about the vaccines in newcomers' spaces. The problem is that the way and which we talked about in the talk before me is that the way to reach to misinformation will be basically trying to create new local networks of or new places for digital spaces, because it still keeps them connected to home, because the newcomers were not actually or did not establish yet local networks of information that they can actually rely on when they arrive in Canada. So they continue trusting these kinds of digital spaces, and specifically private spaces, as was mentioned before. So this actually, we found actually, or Stats found that newcomer families in Canada use the instant messaging platforms, and especially WhatsApp, to share information, especially transnationally and with back home. So this project, the scope of it was to try to generate evidence-based data to understand how the vaccine information or misinformation flows and how it spreads in newcomer digital spaces. So the first part, which I'm not covering today, is just in-depth interviews and focus groups, and I'll give you a list of people to reach out to if you want to know more about this project at the end. And actually, this is basically how to understand, using qualitative methods of in-depth interviews and focus groups, how to to see how digital connectors, basically the bridge builders, or let's call them the leaders of the communities online, how they use and share information related to COVID-19. The second part, which is the computational part, is trying to present methodological insights to how to design effective communication strategies and learn sources of misinformation among marginalized communities and how to counter this misinformation and increase the vaccine uptake. So this computational part is what I'm sharing today with you. And basically we studied or we tried to study two digital spaces. X, it was Twitter then when we were doing the project, and WhatsApp. The Twitter analysis is complete, and I'm sharing it with you today, but we had different challenges getting access to WhatsApp groups. And actually, this is something I'd like to talk about during the Q&A because I believe it pretty much relates to what was said before during the introduction to this section about how private groups are very important compared maybe to public platforms, but also they have their own challenges to access them. So regarding actually understanding or trying to analyze Twitter, we use two types of approaches. We use the structural approach and the content analysis. So for the structural approach, we used methods of social network analysis in order to understand who are the influencers on the public Twitter platform in newcomer digital spaces or places that are talking about issues related to newcomers to Canada and related to the COVID vaccination. And we also used social network analysis to understand the veracity of the shared links that were circulating in these spaces. We also use content analysis in order to understand how do the refugees or newcomer felt about this information that were circulating. And we use topic modeling as well to see what they talk about when they discuss vaccines. And towards the end, I'll share with you how this actually, like small sample, sample of relatively smaller than the bigger sample with that is not only about refugees, how they compare to each other and the amount of misinformation that was circulating. So to understand who are the influencers, we use techniques from social network analysis, looking at the amount of actually links that the people get in terms of the number of retweets they get or the number of mentions. And so, for example, if you are retweeted many times, you are a hub, or you can be actually seen as an expert or someone that can give advice. Or if you retweet a lot or mention many people, maybe you play the role of a broadcaster in the network so that it is known that you are actually someone that can circulate information or misinformation in the network. Or also it can be that you are just a top poster depending on the number of posts that you share. The other way we use social network analysis is that we looked at the network as people mentioning different domains in their tweets. So, and I'm here talking about domains and not just URLs or links. So for example, the BBC will be a domain, and any article that is coming from the BBC or any other domains that relate to the BBC will be the same node. So we looked also at how many links or how many arrows were coming to certain domains to see, because these are the domains that were circulating much in the network. So the data was collected. We collected data from the beginning when they announced COVID as a pandemic, 11th of March, or actually 1 week before 11th of March 2020, and we took actually a span of 2 years period when actually things or the number of tweets started actually fading about the pandemic. And we collected about 110,000 tweets to analyze, and 13% of them were original tweets and the rest were retweets of these original tweets. So looking at the types of engagement, what we have here is the blue bar will be those who are top mentioned. The green bar will be those who are top posting. And the pink bars will be those who are actually top retweeted. So what we found actually is most of the top posters and top retweeted are news agencies or people from the general public, And this is almost everywhere in Twitter, and not just in newcomers spaces. But this actually can give an idea about, especially that we have the general public tweeting much. This can give you an idea about the possibility of circulation of misinformation. We also found that the presence of newcomer agencies, they were actively posting, but not necessarily retweeted much. So if they try even to correct some problems with misinformation that are circulating, there is a problem of reach. In terms of government agencies who are supposed to be the authorities that are circulating accurate information, they had limited presence. They had no original tweets in the data set we looked at. And this data set, as I told you, was about newcomers and all keywords related to vaccine and COVID, and keywords related to Canada and different regions of Canada. And also the health professionals who are authorities to share accurate information. There was no posting of original content. They were not retweeted like news, and not highly mentioned. In terms of factual reporting, we actually used the shared domains, the most shared domains, and we used MediaBuy's fact check to see the veracity of these domains. We found that 25% of these domains are of low or mixed factual reporting, which is basically saying that quarter of what was shared on these places were coming from sources that cannot be much reliable. We also actually found, in terms of the inclination, political inclination of these domains, we found that about 2% were right conspiracy or pseudoscience, and this is an example of a tweet that was shared from one of these platforms. So that was one way first to look at the misinformation. When we looked about sentiment and how people were feeling about COVID and related to certain topics, we found that, for example, talking about African American and their added or their augmented feeling about COVID, that was one of the biggest topics that were talked about with a negative sentiment. And when we looked at COVID, at topic modeling as well, we found that one of the biggest topics were COVID disproportionate effect on Canadian minority groups. And for example, here are two examples of these tweets. They were talking about who lives in the hotspots of COVID, and most of them are minorities, or that the number of cases that were seen in Canada were mostly among racialized or ethnic communities. So these are all tools or methods where we can actually study these communities if we have challenges or of getting into these communities. The last thing I want to share with you is comparing to non-immigrant digital spaces. So what we did is basically we removed all the words that can relate to immigrants or refugees, and we picked 3 time periods which were peak in terms of people talking in the marginalized communities about cases. So one of them was about the discussions related to COVID effect on marginalized groups in Canada. The other one was about the death of a Syrian refugee, Yassin Dabeh, who worked as a long-term care home cleaner, and that was a big issue that was discussed in racialized communities. And also the discussions about the vaccine availability to newcomers. And these were the 3 actually time periods that was talked about. One about discovering in non-refugee communities, they were talking about the pandemic in general and how it is affecting all of Canada. And they were talking about the stay-home order. That was the same time period that refugees were talking about the problem of Yassin Dabeh. And also this one was about finding first cases of COVID, and were at the time that people were talking about first cases of a new strand of COVID, at the time that racialized communities were talking about the lack of vaccination for newcomers. In terms of the veracity of information, we found that low factual reporting or rights conspiracy is highest among the immigrant sample compared to the other non-immigrants. I can talk about these numbers here during the Q&A, why they were also high in the third case study. So that was just a quick presentation about like the findings and of our report, of our research, and trying to present new insights on how to approach misinformation among marginalized communities. If you want actually to contact people related to these projects, you can contact Professor Nadia Kady related to the qualitative research, or Louisa Taylor Hongshi, or myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Fotu. Joan Ozawa will be our next speaker.
Yes, hello everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay. You probably can see two of me. That's because I'm using one device for my audio and the other one for my video. So I'm sorry about that. But you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much. That's the most frequently asked question since the pandemic. Yeah. Okay, so well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there. I'm currently in Brazil doing field work for my dissertation, and I will talk a little bit about that as I go through this presentation. So thanks so much for the opportunity. And so the paper that I'm going to present is how does the Brazilian diaspora in the US make sense of the January 8th insurrection? I study on disinformation, WhatsApp, and transnational conspiracies. So I'm the first author in this paper. It was done with the advice of Dr. Samuel Woolley, who's my advisor, and also Dr. Inga Trauthig. All of us, we work for the Propaganda Lab, which is a vertical of the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. Just a sec. Okay, so the January 8th, everyone here is probably familiar with what happened, but just to give some context, was basically the Brazilian version of January 6th. So after Jair Bolsonaro, the previous Brazilian president, lost the election, a mob of his supporters ransacked the Brazilian presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and the Congress. Believing conspiracies of a fraud election, they intended to promote a coup d'etat and keep Bolsonaro in power. Different from what happened in the US, there's no record of people who died in that event, but they destroyed the buildings, especially the Supreme Court and the Congress. So you can see here a couple of images of the results of their invasion. They destroyed important pieces of art, the buildings themselves, and similar to what happened in the US, after roughly a couple of hours, 2 hours after the insurrection started, that's when finally the police intervened and stopped the attack. So there are investigations happening currently. Many people, hundreds of people were already arrested after the events, but while they were happening, things were pretty slow. So our study is basically concerned about how Jair Bolsonaro supporters from the Brazilian diaspora community used social media spaces to make sense of the attack in Brazil. We also investigate how they took part of the attack and how their perceptions of the Capitol attack, the US Capitol attack, relate to their perceptions of the Brazilian insurrection. A couple of information that could be that are important is that the Brazilian diaspora in the US is the largest population of Brazilians outside of Brazil, and roughly 2 million Brazilians live in the US right now. The little review that we're drawing from is on extremist right-wing populism. Jair Bolsonaro is an extremist right-winger. He is an enthusiast of the military dictatorship that governed Brazil until 1985. He is in favor of criminals militias that are especially prominent in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He is an enthusiast of the use of torture to combat crime. During his government, among his achievements, if we could call it like that, he dismantled the funding of science and education in Brazil. He deforested the Amazon rainforest. He denied the COVID-19 pandemic, and he's often called the tropical Trump. We are also drawing from computational propaganda literature. Bolsonaro systematically adopted the spread of computational propaganda as a method to communicate his political agenda and to attack opponents during his government through the Office of Hatred. The Office of Hatred is a nickname that the Brazilian press gave to the digital media team that worked during his government. It was a physical space within the presidential palace that took care of his social media accounts, and they were famously known for using WhatsApp and social media to attack opponents and to defend the government, with, of course, a lot of spread of disinformation and propaganda. So the same type of method wasn't different with the Brazilian insurrection. A lot of journalistic investigative reports mentioned and reported that WhatsApp and Telegram were especially used to spread disinformation around the insurrection and to also organize the insurrection itself. So our research questions are: which social media spaces did Bolsonaro supporters from the Brazilian diaspora community use to learn about the January 8th attack? What type of content the Bolsonaro supporters consume about the January 8th attack? How did they take part of the attack? And how did the perception of the Bolsonaro supporters from the Brazilian community relate to the perception of the January 8th attack? Our method was we used semi-structured interviews with the Brazilian diaspora community in Austin, Texas. One thing that is interesting is that, as probably everyone here is familiar with, while you do research, sometimes the structure impacts the structure that you have available impacts the research that you are doing, right? We not only do what we want to do. So I'm just saying this because initially our interest, as our research questions stated, was focusing on Bolsonaro supporters. However, as I was recruiting the participants for my interviews, I realized I published a small ad on a Facebook group called Brazilians in Austin, and I realized, as I was recruiting them, that if I was going to write, like, my requirements are: you have to be Brazilian, you have to be over 18 years old, you have to live in the United States, you have to live in the Texan area, and you have to be a Bolsonaro supporter. I realized that no one would talk to me. So as I was doing this recruitment, then we also amplified our sample and said, no, we have to talk to either side of the political spectrum. Otherwise, it's just going to be too hard to talk about this, especially with a PhD in journalism student. So yeah, this is just one of the structural problems that also kind of conducted our research. But in the end, I thought it was good because we could have both the left and the right perspectives, which I think would be enriching, and was enriching to our study. Yeah, so this was just a bit of methodological context. But as I was recruiting Austin, that made a lot of sense because Bolsonaro received roughly 65% of votes in the Houston area. Another important information is that the Brazilian government has several polling stations in the US, so Brazilians can vote. Most of them are connected to the consulate offices in the US. And in the Texan area, Bolsonaro received a percentage of votes that was pretty similar to the total votes that he received in the US, which was roughly 65%. This method is based on previous work that investigated conservative perspectives through interviews and through ethnographic approaches. We conducted snowball sampling. So I did my Facebook ads that I mentioned. I also talked to personal contacts, and then gather more participants to the survey, to the interviews. And then now we are going currently through the process of using a grounded theory approach to generate themes and understand their perceptions about our research questions. So this is actually a good time to talk about this, because what I'm going to show are preliminary results, so we still have time to get back on track, or to get things on track. Let me just see how I'm going with time. Okay, I have 4 minutes. So our preliminary results are, I shouldn't criticize my own results before I talk about them, but I already want to share that I'm a quantitative researcher who is trying to learn to be more qualitative. And in my dissertation, I'm doing mixed methods, and I have members of my dissertation committee who are qualitative researchers, exactly because I want to learn how to be more qualitative. And as I was sharing these results with my advisor, he already gave me some interesting feedback, important feedback, that this is not generalizable, right? This is not a survey. So the results are kind of structured between this left and right logic, as I explained before, because I talked to both sides of the political spectrum. However, I do think that more theorization is important for this work. So I'm going to share following the logic that I have been following so far, but again, this is good space for more discussion on how to make this more theoretical and make this concept more solid, I guess. So regarding our preliminary results, what we have so far. So our first research question: how did what social media spaces the Bolsonaro supporters used to learn about the January 8th attack? What I've seen is a pattern quite clear that while the left, people who are anti-Bolsonaro, did not want to use WhatsApp, they were pretty much against WhatsApp, because they are already very familiar that WhatsApp is a place famous for spreading disinformation. So while the left did not use those spaces at all, the right used WhatsApp as a legitimate source of information. And talking about maybe what could be theoretically more solid about this paper, many of them saw WhatsApp as a space of truth. That's the space where they could actually get the truth about the January 8th attack, since the mainstream media did not support Bolsonaro and was maybe doing a biased coverage. For example, not showing the false narrative that infiltrators from the left were actually promoting the attack. So if the mainstream media was not talking about that, where could I find the truth? That would be on WhatsApp. Then on WhatsApp, they would be talking about how, for example, the false narrative of infiltrators was something real. Our second research question: what type of content Bolsonaro supporters from the Brazilian diaspora consume about the January 8th attack? So similar to what I was mentioning on research question number 1, while the left was consuming content from the mainstream media, the right or the Bolsonaro supporters were mainly using WhatsApp as a legitimate source of information. How did they take part of the January 8th attack? Both sides of the political spectrum did not take part, which makes a lot of sense given that they were in a different country, but they were mainly discussing the events with people back home. But though there is some obvious component because they were in a different country, I was intuitively expecting people to be more engaging, or at least posting on social media about the attacks, their opinions. But most of people, or all of them, said that they did not take part, they did not post, they were just following the events. And the research question number 4, which probably could also have more room for theorization, was about the perception of the Brazilian Diaspora Committee about the Capitol attack, the US Capitol attack. How did that relate to their perception of the January 8th attack? And while the left was against both events, both the US Capitol attack and the Brazilian attack, the right saw almost unanimously both events as a legitimate demonstration, which to me personally seems to be the most concerning element. And this is something that I have been developing here on my field work. I've been also conducting interviews in Brazil, in a small city, very conservative city, kind of similar with the same logic that we were in Texas. We could find a bunch of Bolsonaro supporters. I went to this small city here in Brazil and talked to a bunch of Bolsonaro supporters, and it's pretty much unanimous that they see both events, January 8th and January 6th, as a legitimate demonstration and not an attack on democracy. And I think if we are to follow democracy as a normative a normative value, which I think is important and I agree with, then I think it's very concerning that they are seeing this as both legitimate demonstrations. And another part that I think has also more room for theorization is that the disinformation narratives about the US and Brazil are closely connected in the minds of the Brazilian diaspora living in the US. So the false narrative about a rigged election, both in the US and Brazil, it's again unanimous. All the Bolsonaro supporters believe that the elections were frauded in both countries. And again, I think that this is maybe the most concerning part of this study, because then you're putting the whole democratic system into question, which I think can be very dangerous, especially in Brazil. If you think that we are a democracy, we have been a democracy since '85, right? One day after I was born. So also narratives about socialism, how both Biden and Lula, the current Brazilian governments, are socialists. QAnon narratives have been exported from the US to Brazil, and though QAnon is so specific to Trump, people in Brazil, both from the diaspora communities or living in Brazil, are adopting this narrative, which I find very concerning. So this is the preliminary results that we have so far. I'll be glad to take any questions, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, John. And Dr. Jane Pugh will be our next presenter.
Felicity is I'll repeat myself. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jane Peel, and I'm a postdoc at UMass Amherst. It's really great because we also have a team of researchers doing misinformation on AAPI. So it's like a perfect place to talk about my research. Today, I'll be presenting my research project, which brings together studies of misinformation and disinformation, digital platforms, and diasporic Asian identities and communities. Oh, perfect timing. So particularly, I call for research that contextually understands that the role of digital platforms, especially ethnic, social, and messaging apps, play in shaping Asian diasporic communities and their encounters with misinformation. Such an understanding allows us not only to think of ways that we can better combat misinformation among Asian diaspora communities, but also give voice to marginalized communities, AAPI ones, who have been silenced by the existing stereotypes of model minorities and quiet and complacent Asians. This research is in the beginning phase, so I wanted to present more about the theoretical foundations about this research and how I came to conceptualize platforms that intimate and intimidate platforms, which is a word of saying. This is not what it should work. Okay. So my argument is that ethnic social messaging apps create an intimate and intimidating environment for Asian diasporic communities, providing both a sense of belonging and cultural connectivity that is crucial to diasporic people, but also creating an information environment that is more susceptible to this and misinformation. I picked the example of KakaoTalk, which is a native Korean social media platform, and that's where Korean community. I'd like to unpack and open up my research with this anecdote, which came from a focus group interview that I did for another study, investigating about how digital platforms function as cultural infrastructures for diasporic community. And this research was just published at IJOC yesterday, so please take a look. Thank you. In one group interview, one participant shared her experience of receiving a KakaoTalk message from her mother. It was like May 2021, which was at the height of Asian hate during the pandemic in the US. So the student who was studying at the US University of Illinois was talking about her experience. The news that Asian hate was reaching its peak in New York City just broke out. It was in the news about how there was a man harassing random Asian women on the street. Yeah, it was it's a great time. Sorry. After that. Yes, perfect. Oh, Siri just said it's okay. 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 So about this incident, her mom expressed worries and sent a message that she received from her other friend about how to avoid being the victim of Asian hate crime. So it was important that she pretend and that she knew that everyone knew that she wasn't Chinese and she made that sure to everyone. So recalling this incident, she explained how she felt really uncomfortable knowing that it is coming from an unreliable source and obviously hateful, but she mentioned how she couldn't react and leave the chat. So I became curious, like why was KakaoTalk so important to her despite the discomfort she felt? And why was she afraid? And what does this tell about the misinformation environment created by KakaoTalk? One that Koreans are very much subject to. So from this, we can see that there are multiple factors interplaying that surround diasporic Asian community and their encounter with misinformation. First is the being in the state of diaspora and displacement, where people need something to grasp on, to feel connected to their homeland and remember their cultural belongings. Second is the cultural importance of KakaoTalk and the cultural intimacy it generates through its embeddedness in Korean society, everyday life, to the extent that it almost functions like an infrastructure. The third is the cultural implications of KakaoTalk, coupled with the state of being in diaspora, of creating the fear of leaving the app, making diaspora Koreans feel like if they leave the app, they're gonna be leaving Korean society and cutting ties off. So in actual interview, there was a Korean person who mentioned how Koreans who don't use KakaoTalk in the US, they feel like they're pretending too hard to not be Koreans. So based on the interviews, we have to understand what it means to be in diaspora and what social media apps mean to diaspora people. Being in diaspora is like being in the constant in-betweenness between the homeland and the homeland. To overcome this feeling of displacement, people have been historically relying on ethnic media, which is defined as a media by and for ethnics and often in their native language. This allows them to help feel connected to their homeland and remember their cultural belongings. And with the transnational connectivity that social media provides, social messaging apps become their connection to homes with people in diaspora. And as you can see from the quotes here, diaspora Koreans also regarded KakaoTalk as their connection to home, as well as making new connections to the people that they newly meet here. For example, like when I first moved to Amherst, I got invited to a KakaoTalk group chat called Kimchi Network, which is really like people selling kimchi to like a restaurant owner with selling kimchi. Just right away, I was invited to this group chat. So Acknowledging this dynamic, I call attention to ethnic social messaging apps. So how have digital platforms shaped misinformation environment and what role does it play? This question has been answered a lot with a lot of people focusing on like Facebook and Twitter and recently social messaging apps like WhatsApp. However, what escapes our focus is ethnic platforms and apps which are made outside of the US and originally made specifically for Asian communities in their native languages, like with WeChat in China, Kakao Talk in Korea, and Line in Japan, and in Malaysia. So ethnic social messaging apps are important because they function like cultural infrastructure. And I take the example of Kakao Talk. And this really extends beyond Kakao Talk and other apps such as WeChat, because they have very much a lot of similarities in functions and cultural penetration. So first, there are those kind of messaging apps are social messaging apps, but they function and then their functions are actually beyond messaging apps. They are all-in-one apps that combine vastly different socio-economic activities on their one account, such as sending gifts, hailing taxis, mobile banking, listening to music, federal ID checking, and ordering food. So it is within the host of homeland, it's impossible to live in Korea without using Kakao Talk. So secondly, they have very deep and wide social cultural penetration. More than 90% of Koreans use Kakao Talk, and it is considered as the default mode of communication. And this extends well beyond the boundaries of the Korean land, even to diasporic Koreans. People who do not, so people cannot discard Kakao Talk after leaving the country. Hence, it is important to identify Kakao Talk is related to identity as Koreans, allowing them to perform cultural norms and practice Korean identity. It is an identity marker for people who they can hold on to its well-being diaspora. So as such, I think it got a little bit weird. So that is of Kakao Talk creates duality for Koreans who live abroad but still live in the Kakao Talk media space, especially when it comes to information and news. So on the one hand, there is a feeling of intimacy undeniably attached to the information environment of Kakao Talk. The message and information come from intimate relations, such as family members. Even if their misinformation, as the previous interview kind of illustrated, these come in the form of like real concerns from family back home. Moreover, the misinformation delivered through Kakao Talk is very intimate and relevant. That is the state of marginalization of diaspora communities within the homeland's mainstream news media plays a role. For instance, one of the heightened issues among Korean diaspora community members that I've been watching in this online community called Miss the USA, which is a women, the online communities for women in USA, was about the discharge of Japanese nuclear treated water. A lot of online community members were lamenting how there were lack of coverages in the US mainstream news media. So this kind of marginalization leaves room for misinfo to deep seep into the diaspora communities. Media manipulation, specifically targeting Asians, may intentionally play upon this marginalized data diasporas, seeping through where Asians feel the least represented. Lastly, media setting is also highly intimate, where language settings is all in native languages. And the platformized nature of Kakao Talk that allows in-lab link shares kind of creates this intimate information. And there was on the other hand, inevitability of the use of Kakao Talk, even in diaspora, and the inescapability of the app makes an intimidating environment where diaspora users cannot simply put a pause on using the app. So then with this understanding, I argue that such ethnic social messaging apps complicate and make it more difficult for diasporic agents to combat misinformation, as these apps are essentially tied to their identity. The struggles to combat misinfo are harder for agents. There are multiple factors, but I'll just like rush through because we are out of time. And then of course, one of the cultural factors and which Pranav have very well shown how the family dynamics and cultural norms play effects it impact it. And diasporic state where we really need a state sense of belonging. And I also then for me, I wanted to highlight and add on my understanding how that there are technocultural factors such as digital platforms that creates this kind of intimate and intimidating environment for diasporic communities. What I'm arguing is that, however, what I'm arguing is that it's not the inevitability of misinformation among inevitable, like the state of misinformation spread among Asian diasporic communities. We're saying that they are inherently more vulnerable to media manipulation. What this kind of argument does is further marginalize diasporic communities from the necessary debates and perpetuate the modern minority stereotypes that sees Asians as a complacent. On the contrary, I am arguing to see the role that digital platforms as informational and cultural infrastructures play in shaping the Asian American communities encounter and experience with misinformation. Understanding both the uniquely challenging state of diasporic state and the cultural power of digital platforms is important to explore how the diasporic communities fight against and show resistance to misinformation in their own ways. So these might not look as apparent and obvious as directly correcting your family member, like when you receive a misinformation message on Kakao Talk. But it may take a different form, such as sending your aunties like relevant personal relatives narratives, or creating kind of youth support groups outside of the media space. So with this in mind, I don't know why this kind of like my beautiful presentation slide all messed up. So with this in my next research, I am seeking to conduct qualitative in-depth research with diasporic Korean youth to explore their experiences of receiving misinformation via Kakao Talk. And I'm hoping to kind of ask these kind of questions. So which is like, what are the struggles for diasporic Korean youth when dealing with misinformation delivered through Kakao Talk? How do they negotiate misinformation messages in their own terms? So what is their resistance? And how do they navigate the intimate and intimidating misinformation environment? So I would love to get feedback on my conceptualization and theoretical approach and research suggestions or anything else. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Pugh, and we'll switch to Zoom again and welcome Sarah Nguyen, our last presenter of this panel.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. I'm so sorry. Zoom decided to update right as I'm about to share my screen. So I'm gonna have to quit and reopen, and it shouldn't take more than 90 seconds. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, and let me go ahead and share. So I'm really glad that I'm following up with Jane here because I feel like there's a really nice segue happening. And I would like to thank everyone for creating this space and letting me join virtually to talk and share about my work and be in conversation with you all. Let me just hide this floating meeting controls. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Nguyen, and I will be presenting to you today a work in progress research about finding home and dodging displacement amidst information disorder in Little Saigon. So especially following after Jane, it's a really nice honing in on a specific Asian diaspora community and also within a specific physical geographical place and how misinformation and marginalization shows up there. So my pronouns are she, they. I'm a doctoral candidate at University of Washington's Information School, and a lot of my research is grounded in community participatory practices. Here to the right, you'll see a few of my co-researchers who come from the community and who work within organizations in the community as liaisons, connectors, and just general project managers to support the work that I'm not just looking from an outside point of view of how displacement and home and belonging are found within this specific site geolocation, but also being grounded in the people who actually are there alongside the socio-technical issues that we'll be looking at. So Derek and Leslie are coming from a nonprofit organization that looks at building and managing properties within the International District in Little Saigon area, which I'll dive into as a place. And then Valerie Tran here works for a different nonprofit that hones in specifically on a particular block district within the geographical location within International District, which is called Little Saigon. And they were of immense help and able to provide me a segue to connect with the community as someone who is new to the geographic location of Seattle's International District. So I'll start off with just giving you background on why I started this project and kind of the impetus behind it. So here on the left-hand side, you'll see in 1972, we have a group of Asian American protesters and activists in the Seattle's International District calling for, as you can see on the signage, humbaos, not hot dogs. This is a phrase that has become popular within the region because humbaos are within the Asian diasporic and particularly Chinese are these little breaded buns with usually with meat or vegetables inside. And then, as you know, in American culture, hot dogs. They were saying humbaos, not hot dogs, because the city of Seattle was slated to build a ginormous stadium for sports and music and concert fans, which would basically bulldoze down the entire neighborhood of International District. Through the work of these activists in 1972 and moving forward, the stadium, while it was still built, it was pushed to the outskirts of the neighborhood so that not the entire neighborhood was made into a parking lot just for the stadium, but it still kept the residential housing, apartments, and family businesses, and the stadium is just next door. And then you see, fast forward to 2017 here, the struggle continues. And there is, in this particular activist working group, they're asking for yet another anti-advocacy against the city because the city wants to build another large institution that would actually push out a lot of community members. So again, the community, but particularly here you see within the Vietnamese community, they're asking to the city to communicate with this community more and be able to put in community input before building a ginormous stadium or another state-owned institution. So this issue is ongoing within the Seattle International District community. And also more recently within this past year, Seattle's International District, which includes Little Saigon, was named one of 11 of the most endangered historic places in the United States by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This means that not only is the place endangered of further displacement and also the loss of the culture and the history of the actual place, but also at the same time, organizations such as the National Trust for Historic Preservation would be looking to support efforts and push forward any efforts to be able to save and preserve this place. And then the longer idea of what preservation can mean, we'll dive into as I go into the research. So overall, within this research, because this goes into a very physical geographic location, but then it also goes into this history of place within an immigrant and diasporic community of how they share information with each other and communicate with each other in order to preserve this place or space, in order also to combat any sort of mis or disinformation that the city or the state or the county government is placing upon them in order to displace them. I really wanted to learn alongside with my community researchers, the contextual experience of the community themselves. What is the actual history and embodied knowledge that they have amongst each other of the neighborhood and of their understanding of these authoritative figures giving them information? That was the first base point and the foundation. And then how do stakeholders, not just people who live there or work there, but then building owners, shop owners, and then also more largely, these offshore building owners who have come in and developed new land in the neighborhood, how do they build relationships with each other? How do they build knowledge with each other? How do they know what to build amongst each other? And then what is their collective power within the wider community? Something else that we wanted to learn moving forward, since this was really grounded and motivated by nonprofit organizing work, was how can they move forward? How can they build sustainable housing or build sustainable commercial spaces so that residents, shop owners don't get displaced in future? What are their needs and desires and wants in order to have a place where they would stay and not leave? And then last is, what are the general barriers and needs that the community needs in order to communicate with each other for continued efforts? The protests that we saw earlier in those pictures from 1972 and 2017, while those are amazing pictures because we got the snapshot of that, the city is quite large. So it is a smaller community that is actually aware of what's going on in the city. Sometimes, and especially within those two cases, residents who live in the area or business owners or even visitors don't even know that the stadium is being built or a new shelter is being built until construction is broken ground. How do we actually communicate this information prior so that residents, shop owners, and community members can bring in their voice in order to tell the state or the city that they don't want this, or what are better ways to be able to integrate these two things together before it's actually built and there's no turning back because of the investments made. So talking about all this place very nebulously, but you'll see on this map is a very close-up version of this larger, wider Seattle area called the International District. As you all know, or you might know, Seattle is in state of Washington. We have the waterway, which is the Puget Sound and the Pacific Ocean, over on the left-hand side on the west, near 4th Avenue here. I don't know if you can see my arrow, so let me know if I can. I'll just try to be very descriptive here. And then on the east side, in the orange, we have a historically Black neighborhood called the Central District. This entire area within Seattle is very well known to have been redlined historically and to have been pushed a lot of immigrants and community of colors to a specific neighborhood. This specific neighborhood also has a history of manufacturing zoning, which means there's a lot of toxicity within the land and the soil. So you can see as I go into the historical context, I'm really going into all the different factors, environmental, social, political, within real estate, of what are creating these factors of tension, and then how it has created a lot of information disorder within the community. In the particular teal area, that is what is bounded as International District. And what you see in that big gap, greenish gray gap in the middle, is Highway I-5, which runs up and down north and south of the west coast of the United States. So all the way up to Vancouver, all the way down to San Diego, California, and into Tijuana. So this is a very large highway that has cut this immigrant community right in the middle. The left side, which is west, is Chinatown and Japantown. Also includes Manila Town. which is a very pan-Asian community. And then on the right side, after 1975 was when the Vietnamese community came into Seattle and has found a sort of home on the east side here of the highway. So within all of that, also on the west side of 4th Avenue is downtown Seattle, which includes, as many might call, Amazon land, Meta, Google, big tech moving in and taking over where a lot of their offices and new businesses coming up. With that comes a lot of seep and kind of a crawl over of a lot of these technologists coming in and taking over the space of these immigrant communities. So we see a lot of Seattle growth. The displacement risk has increased drastically within the community. So a lot of these immigrant communities are no longer able to stay within where they find home or where they find community within their shops or within their community organizations and festival and gatherings. They have to move north or south. The opportunity index for economic opportunity has increased. And then this ongoing, as you can see, historical systemic racism, interpersonal racism, and modern day challenges continues. So all of that, I have to give you that history because within this research, it's very critical to be able to understand historical and cultural context, to understand where these communities are coming from before we can get into the socio-technical part of where the platforms come in. But within that, a lot of my research, as I was saying earlier, is really based on critical refugee studies because it is grounded in not just the Asian diasporic community in general, but also specifically within the Vietnamese community coming into the US, which became a turn of the Asian diasporic and Asian-American and American ethnic studies, where one of the largest populations of refugees and migration coming in at one time to the US. So this, the social and political needs and tensions within the US changed a lot during that time. Also, as I was saying earlier, a lot of this is about information being passed between state, county, and people who have ownership of land to this group of a community that are immigrant and refugees, and how the information becomes chaotic and complex at times. Not all of it is disinformation, not all of it is misinformation, but some of it can show up as that, and how that type of information becomes a very complex and disordered space between the two. And then going into how to approach all of this, I really appreciate all the previous presenters looking at social media and online and digital platforms. A lot of that was a little bit more difficult for me to contend with looking at this particular geographical location, because Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Line, Viber, all of these spaces are very popular within this diasporic community as they are translocal citizens of this particular area. But because I was so rooted in this particular geographic location, I wanted to ground it in having the voice of the community members. So the research started as a community participatory research project where community members who lived, worked, or hung out and received services in the neighborhood were a large part of driving the research questions, the research discussions, and the analysis of the research itself. So through that, we did in-depth interviews with not just community members, but then also policymakers to really understand what is this more top level of information flow coming into the community, as well as bottom up between the community and then policymakers between that. Alongside that, we also got a broad survey, which included not just people who were active members within the community, but people who also liked to visit. And this is where we got a lot of input on the different types of media and communication channels that people used and relied on to understand where to find housing in this neighborhood, or where to find events and services, programs, and resources within the neighborhood itself. And then last within that, pulling from those interviews and then the survey itself, we were able to go into a preliminary kind of content analysis and discourse analysis with the community researchers of what's happening on Instagram as a space of information, as well as activism to combat with displacement within the neighborhood, as well as understand how to find sustainable housing in the neighborhood as well. So within this preliminary research, I'll go through really quickly because I think I don't have that much time to talk about what were the salient narratives in this space and what types of accounts really talked towards this diasporic and trans-local type of conversation of finding a place of belonging, finding a place of activism within the community for more long-term home and belonging within the community. So the first space of narrative, which isn't new and does show up in previous research, is historical distrust. Like I said earlier, ongoing distrust and systemic racism within the, not just, this shows up obviously within the nation and across the world, but we're looking specifically at the Seattle areas and the historic events that have happened there. 1967 was when Interstate 5, the highway that I was talking about, came in, plopped right in the middle of the neighborhood, really displacing a lot of single residency occupancy homes, family apartments, small businesses, family businesses, parks, etc. So that was kind of a large part of the displacement and distrust that community members had on the city as a place of developing and bringing economic opportunity to the city. From that picture that I showed you from the very beginning, we'll also look at the stadium, 1972. Yesler Terrace was one of the first, it was actually the first low-income housing projects in Seattle, which created a lot of community and was a very stable home for many years. But then in 2003, they did a redevelopment, which further displaced more families. The city, in this case, within, we see an Instagram post, but then also within the interviews, a lot of community members talking about how the city told them that they would be able to come back within 5 years after the redevelopment happened. That was not the case. High rises were built up, it was more expensive, these families could not come back to the neighborhood, so further displacement. The Navigation Center is a shelter for people who are experiencing houselessness and addiction, and that was also plopped in the middle of Little Saigon, which further made displacement within people who found home in there, because there's this pitting against different communities who are being marginalized in the city without further social service resources, such as mental health or food or housing or anything like that. And then we see ongoing police unit encampment and suites. So this was something that throughout the Instagram post, with also matched within the interviews of these narratives of pulling from historical distrust, of not being able to really trust of what will be redeveloped and newly developed within the city. Something that was interesting that showed up more in the Instagram post than in any other Facebook or YouTube or interview research that we had done previously, particularly within the Vietnamese community, was actually intergenerational unification versus a polarization. And this was mostly within the imagery and then the calls towards activism of seeing more elders within this neighborhood finding a voice and finding action and agency in order to talk about their experiences, talk about why they find home and why it's important to keep this neighborhood as home, which then also brought a younger generation to have energy to support them. Whereas in a lot more political research and prior, there was a lot more intergenerational divides. So that was pretty interesting to see there. And then you can see these cultural dimensions also kind of calls into this intergenerational unification. There was a lot of calls in order to preserve a space through food influencers or calls to save this family business or saving this reminiscence and nostalgia towards not just Asian culture, but particularly Southeast Asian culture, pulling from archival footage or festival events. This particular post that we see here is a Seattle-based TikTok star who is Vietnamese and Cambodian, and she actually got her viralness from being able to go to different family-owned businesses within the International District and tell people about the amazing food that she was eating, and then also calling towards preserving the neighborhood. So there's a whole other body of work about the food influencer scene within Asian communities online. And it was a really nice bridge between this idea of, in order to bring this information kind of chaotic system into like a more meaningful, meaning-making space, was through this like food influencer practice. Another narrative that came up a lot was about power dimensions and about the idea of these mutual aid groups or more grassroots community-based groups really calling towards these offshore developers who are building high rises and luxury buildings in the space, and how they are gentrifying. So while at the same time, advertisements from these high rises were talking about how great this building is with, say, a gym on the ground floor or how close it is to transportation. Also at the same time, people were getting posts about how this new space would also be a space of gentrification as well, which caused a lot of divisions, but then also more activism within the space. So going to pass through a couple of the themes here just because I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say that within this research, since it is preliminary, I really want to pull towards these sort of theoretical concepts that I was talking to earlier broadly. So input there would be great. But then as a wrap up with the nonprofit groups that I was working with and the community-based groups, and kind of rounding out this idea of how do we work within misinformation and marginalized communities. What was really rewarding with this was that being connected towards these nonprofit groups, we worked to build towards these what we called action plans. And we broke them down into advocacy, policy, and practice actions that not just these nonprofit groups can work towards, but community groups can pressure policymakers to help fight this displacement, but then also build towards sustainable housing and sustainable commercial spaces for these small businesses as well. And so this was just a short list of some of the action plans that we came up with. And to close it out, just as a plug, one of the also other things of this larger research project came with a lot of data because it was so multi-method. We also built this short graphic novel in order to reach the community outside of a digital space and be able so that they can talk to each other within an analog space and really get it so that they are backgrounded into the geographic location. So if you'd like to see the zine that we created that is bilingual, you can grab it here on the QR code as well as a URL. A digital version is available. This is just one of our favorite pages pulled from the data. And further is just more social media analysis because there's so much data out there and being able to understand who are the influencers on there. More community workshops, really getting them grounded on this map making idea of really understanding their neighborhood and gaining sort of a voice in this space. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank all the community partners, CTAP for hosting this space and really creating the opportunity for me to share this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And now, if anyone has questions for any of our presenters or Dr. Malhotra, feel free to raise your hand or post in the Zoom Q&A.
Thank you. Oh, a very great presentation, everybody. One of the interesting things for me is you're using English to talk about issues that obviously are not English-speaking issues. How do you find the translation from the Korean or Vietnamese into English, and how does that affect the perception of the research?
I love that question because it is a challenge. I think it doesn't really capture the whole, I guess, the feelings and affection that's, or like just feeling the cultural connotations that one language has. I think that is just a just matter of translation, and then we do have to understand that there is always, when it's translation, it's always there is some kind of my understanding as well. I think that's how I've been approaching translation works in general. And of course, I think with this is also not a direct answer to your question. I was thinking about how the example that I was talking about, this like language differences, about how Korean diaspora communities and online, they were frustrated about the non-representation of Japanese nuclear treated water. And then I think there was one post about how like one person commenting about why it is in English it's nuclear treated water when it's Korean, and I know like in Chinese as well, like it's called nuclear infected water. So like that was kind of like the translation aspects that some of the diaspora communities are questioning about. And I think that might be like understanding how that transition and then how that also impacts the misinformation element. I think that could be an interesting topic as well. Not answering your question, obviously.
I can add to that. I think in terms of translation, yes, it is always a challenge. It's always a challenge also like conceptually and theoretically. When we have tried to address that in my own work is kind of drawing on more theorizations that are indigenous to that context. But even within that, like for someone like me who does work on like the Indian diaspora, there are like multiple languages within that diaspora that I am not fluent in either, which also kind of ends up privileging certain languages and certain subgroups versus others. So I think one thing to also consider as we've like all talked about these kind of different diasporic communities is that it is not an attempt to kind of homogenize them. Like within them, there's like so much regional variance, language related variance, and to always kind of be mindful of that as well, that everything that's been presented here is kind of one slice of a much larger pie, I would say.
I can add on to that. Sorry, I don't know if someone was about to talk. I can't really see, and it's kind of hard to hear. But I will say that was though actually like one of the theme slides that I skipped was about the language barriers, and I would say that within that's something that we've been working on as well, because especially if you're looking at large amounts of social media data, it's like will slow down your research a lot, and working in this space of academia that does create a bottleneck. So it was interesting to do this. This is the first time I did it like very community participatory focused, where my community researchers who worked with me were translators between our communities. So we had not just Mandarin, but Cantonese translators, as well as Vietnamese translators, Tagalog. So a lot of that allowed it to be, and we're talking about home space, which is a very intimate type of conversation where people might not feel comfortable because of maybe ICE or something else. Maybe their landlords aren't treating them well. So I think that that was our attempt to break down those barriers so that not just on the online space are we just taking and extracting from it, but then also finding these intimate conversations in language and then offering them the space and time to really express themselves through these language barriers.
Next question, Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for these discussions. I love one thing that really struck me on Jane's talk is the use of cacao talk. And I wonder for the other participants on this panel studying ethnic community throughout, are there similar enclaves of social media, ethnic social media, like what Jane described in your own communities? And then Jane, a question for you. Has there been any discussion, because I noticed you talked a lot about the anti-AAIP sentiment at the beginning of your talk. Is there any discussion within your participants regarding surveillance in these spaces and how participation in these ethnic social media spaces might open them up to government surveillance, public surveillance, increased harassment, and like navigating that. So one for kind of the broad around, I guess, James discussion, and then one just specifically for you.
Is this gonna be the participants first, or?
Okay.
Yeah.
I can go in and say that, yes, there's definitely ethnic enclaves within social media spaces and also private messaging apps specifically. I think a lot of the participants and then also previous research has talked to these more private messaging platforms as very generative spaces for these transnational communities. Within the Vietnamese diaspora, we looked at Instagram just because we were also looking at this conversation between authoritative figures and then also within the community, like city government, county, state, and then housing developers. But more intimately, which is something that we haven't looked at just because access to data, as we all know, within these apps are very difficult, is Zalo. It's quite new. So that one has a whole plethora of affordances that we have no idea about.
Can I have her hand raised? Yeah.
I can add to this from Canada. Yeah, when we were doing actually the research, I told you there was part that was qualitative, and we were trying to access some WhatsApp groups, and they were actually these sorts of ethnic enclaves on WhatsApp groups, and we had our informants that can get us to and they know the language. The problem was the matter of trust, and not only trust of the government. It's basically because we were reaching out to the admins of the groups. The admins were actually a bit concerned about their social image within the groups. So we had someone who came to me and we were talking, I was convincing them that the data, there will be actually privacy and all of this, and the research team is the only group that is going to look at the data, and they were okay to start actually collecting the data. But then when they went back to the community, it looks like they actually faced some backlash from the community, and they started actually calling them names like you're a mole, you're trying to get our data and circulate it with other people, and all of these things. So they came and actually rejected participating in the research again, and they told me, you don't know the amount of frustration that we get because we are just admins of the group. They think that we take money for data and all of these things. And this is a matter of trust. So that's actually one thing, apart from, these were people from black people and backgrounds from Africa and also from Latin America. So the problem is not just trust with the government or maybe surveillance or these things. The problem is actually trust even in the leaders of their own communities. They can participate in a group to just get information, but that doesn't mean that they trust everyone in this group, including the social media admins that created the groups.
Just to follow up on that, because I think it relates to the second question as well. In my own works, I looked at this idea, exactly what Dina mentioned, of like perceptions of visibility in these more private spaces. And because I was covering like a variety of platforms, I did talk to a lot of people, some who were using WeChat, KakaoTalk, Line as well. And really these perceptions of visibility and kind of that affordance of visibility and the way it operates depends on all of these contextual factors. So for example, when I talked to people using WeChat, they said, well, yes, a private chat is only visible to us, but we presume it's also visible to the government. The same was not true for someone in a different context who was using WhatsApp, but then was true for someone who said, well, in a private Facebook group, the admin has kind of all the power. Also, there are kind of norms about screenshotting, kind of going back to our previous conversation about like, well, technically anything can be screenshotted within these private spaces and shared. And so it really depends on kind of the strength of the relationships between the group, but also these ideas of surveillance and kind of within which context do these apps that are related to specific communities, kind of how they operate.
Yeah, and then if Joao isn't, I don't know if Joao wants to add on to the conversation, but I thank you, Francesca, for your question, and I think like Pranav, you were kind of answering that with me. I love how the question of surveillance, and I think it really just triggered another point of my mind, because first I wasn't thinking about surveillance aspect of it, because for me, a lot of like participants, when I was asking about the question, about, you know, like how have you experienced Asian hate and how have you been receiving information about it? They were more wanting to like get it out. I think that was the state of marginalization that they were experiencing. They wanted to rant about it, or like, this is what I experienced. But in the other hand, I think that's the flip side of being another like a element of peer surveillance. I think how they want to kind of expand this idea of like, oh, this is like the information that I've been getting, but then are you participating in like spreading this information, or are you participating in this kind of, you know, information regarding Asian hate? So I think it is about this like peer surveillance, about like screenshotting and then also like spreading it just to get the kind of like spreading out the news so that it becomes more of a not really like a governmental or institutional surveillance, but then more of like the personal level of surveillance. So I think that's interesting that the surveillance is so related to the idea of technology and platforms. But for me, like I haven't thought about it, but now like after your question and then Pranav, it's becoming like tied together as a surveillance as well. Thank you.
We'll take one more question before we all get lunch. If someone has one more question. Well, time for lunch then.